everybody. Good to see you. Today we'll be talking about some of the effects of mass media. Now, obviously, we've only got about 40 minutes to do this. I would love to take a week and a half to do this, so I'm going to talk about two of the major effects that have been researched and studied, and then on your own, you can certainly go do more because it's just absolutely a very interesting area to study. It's kind of like medicine. Periodically we will have new vaccinations that come out or new medications that hit the market. And then sometimes, perhaps 10, 20 years down the road, there are suddenly lawsuits and people say, if you ever used this and you ever had a heart attack, or if you ever used this and you had issues with breathing, then there's this gigantic lawsuit that occurs against the company. Well, in many respects, the same is holding true for mass media. You've had situations where people come and say, hey, I think that if you use the cell phone a lot, you have a tendency to perhaps get some ear cancer, right? Because you're holding the phone a lot, and so you have ear cancer. And then in a couple years, the research shows, no, that's not necessarily true. So what we're dealing with here are some of the impacts of mass media, some of the slightly older forms. You'll see when we get there, a lot of this is on television. You say, well, Mrs. Morris, isn't that antiquated? Well, the bottom line is we haven't had the internet around for 20 years to see what will be the final outcomes. I have heard some physicians and some in the medical community say, for example, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Ritalin. You know that 80% of the market for Ritalin is in the United States, and I find that very interesting. I think there are children who definitely need Ritalin, and I think that unfortunately sometimes we just give it very, very quickly. What I've heard some physicians say is it's going to be interesting to see what happens in 20 years. How is this medication that is meant to help children stay in control, how is this going to impact their livers perhaps in 20 years? How is it going to impact their pancreas in 20 years? Those are somewhat unknown. So the theories that we're going to deal with today are theories that have been tested, have been retested, and we'll see some of those impacts. And I think then we can expand some of that research into the impacts that probably will hold true for the internet and perhaps for cell phones and etc. All right? Remember, hey, we started off early with this one, didn't we? In our field, we want to be able to make generalizations about the way people communicate and then the effects of the communications. Because if we can make some generalizations, if we can find some baseline situations, there is the tendency to be able to say, then perhaps this is the best way to communicate. When we're dealing with mass communication, Marshall McLuhan is just a key name. He is oftentimes known as the granddaddy of understanding how technology was really being used. And he was really, in many respects, he is viewed as being a real cornerstone for understanding the research of media. And if you look at the dates of his life, you recognize how far ahead his understanding really was, because he passed away in 1980. That was well before we had the mass usage of cell phones and well before we had the mass usage of Skypes in the homes. Today my daughter called from Argentina, and that was wonderful to be able to see her, but that would not have been the case in 1980. Marshall McLuhan could not have picked up his phone and called through a video camera, talked to somebody in Argentina. But listen to what he asserted, listen to what he understood, and I think you'll find that he has real basis for what he discussed. Right? And he talked about technological determinism. He was known as, please mark this down, the oracle of the electronic age, even back in the 60s. And again, look at what we had in the 60s. Really limited as far as we were concerned. You didn't have home computers. You certainly didn't have laptops, and yet this man was really a forethinker. He referred to his ideas as probes because his goal was to show a relationship between the media and culture. He wanted to show the relationship that existed. And he said, I don't have to discover the link, or I'm sorry, he wanted to discover the link He didn't have to just simply prove them. Okay, so he found great satisfaction in discovering the links, not just improving the links. He said, I want to be cutting edge, right? I know there are links between the culture and media, and I want to discover them. So he was always thinking, and analyzing. For example, obviously, during McLuhan's lifetime, born in 1911, he would have been able to understand that World War I and World War II coverage would have been much more. This is really World War II, isn't it? I'm looking at the headline FDR. Um, it was a lot in the written word, correct? And then we had those times, we've talked about this before, but you could go into, at the time, many people would go to the movie theater, perhaps to see an old black and white film. And then preceding that film would have been a 10-minute update, a news update on how the war was going. And that changed immensely, didn't it, during Vietnam? The pictures were taken and then they were shown on the 6 o'clock news. So even simple things like war coverage, Marshall McLuhan would have seen these very graphic changes occur. So what we want to discuss today are 3 of his very famous quotes and then discuss why they were so famous. What was he recognizing here? The first one, depending on the book you read, some people will say the medium is the message, and Marshall McLuhan also was noted as saying the medium is the massage. Very, very interesting. Either way, the medium is the message or the medium is the massage. The massage, the understanding, what is it bringing about? You say, well, I really don't understand what that means. All right, well, make sure you write that down and then let's discuss it. What if the war coverage, notice at the top I say war coverage of 9/11. What if your information regarding this situation of the Twin Towers and of the airplanes flying into them and then into the ultimate tragic, complete implosion of those buildings? What if you received all your information via a text message, right? So that you would have gotten words. Perhaps you would have seen a small picture, a small video, but it would have been, fairly tiny, correct? Versus what if you'd been able to hear it on the radio? Because a text message really is void of most nonverbal communications, isn't it? You simply are getting the words. But the radio, you would have been able to hear the horrific tone in the speaker's voice, and you would have been able to, I think, very quickly grasp a hold of the tragedy that was occurring. Now, what if you gained information regarding 9/11 because you were watching your television? Now you hear the audio, you can hear the frustration and the screams and the horror, but you also see it. So do you understand what Marshall McLuhan was saying? And I would say, again, well ahead of the understanding, the medium is the massage because it helps us understand. How is it creating that picture in our mind's eye? And hence, great truth in the medium is the message. Now, you say, well, Mrs. Morris, how does that impact us? I think it should impact us amazingly. Listen, crew, there are times when we should not be sending certain information via an email. Because isn't it true that emails in the business realm can be misunderstood because tones cannot be inserted? I don't care how many emoticons you put in and how many smiley faces or snarly faces. Emails can be misunderstood. There's times when you either need to pick up the phone so that they can hear you, or you need to walk down to an office so that they can see you. But great wisdom in understanding and recognizing what is the best way to get my message across, because the medium is the message. Next, Mr. McLuhan went on. Very fascinating. We're going to spend a couple slides on this one. But I want you to write down is what's in red, okay? That the electronic media are turning the planet into a global village. Again, this is in 1980, so write this down and then let's talk about it. That the electronic media are turning the planet into a global village. Now, if you think about that, what was going on in the world? Well, No, you still had some carryovers of the Cold War, right? You had the United States being very separate from Russia. You had the Berlin Wall, and the desire when Ronald Reagan stood and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, bring down this wall," and people said, "You have got to be kidding me! There is no way that wall between East and West Germany will ever be severed. That is just for a lifetime." And here stands Marshall McLuhan saying, "Hey, wait a minute. I think the electronic media are turning the planet into a global village." And what did he mean? Well, let's read a little bit here. He said the age of print had its obituary tapped out by the telegraph. The electronic media are re-tribalizing the human race. Instant communication has returned us to a pre-alphabetic oral tradition where sound and touch are more important than sight. The planet is like a general store where nosy people keep track of everyone else's business. Wow. Fast forward that 30 years. Is it true now that nosy people keep track of everybody else's business via Twitter, via Facebook? Marshall McLuhan had no understanding, no comprehension of that. I would say he was light years ahead of his time. What he's asserting here is that technology itself is not necessarily moral. In other words, a cell phone is not necessarily moral or immoral. A computer is not necessarily moral or immoral. But the technology, here's what he really wanted to help people understand, was that technology, he believed, was going to move mankind, move countries from being very individualized to just being collective identities. That's what he wrote. And isn't that true? We consider today's age. And we're going to keep talking about the global media, but let me just say this. During a recent Olympics, when I saw a commercial for Visa, it wasn't Go America, Go Canada. You know what it was? It was Go. I would say that is definitely a movement from individualism, right, to this collective identity. Wow. Wow. All right, let's keep going with his discussion then of turning the planet into a global village. And he wasn't saying this was right or wrong. He was just foreseeing how communication was going to change things. All right. Number 3 then, so I hope you understand the global village. This kind of merges right in with number 3, which says then that the literary man exchanged an eye for an ear. Now, you think, well, isn't that backwards? Didn't we exchange the ear for the eye? Let's talk this through, and I think you'll understand it. That a literary man exchanged an eye for an ear. We've talked earlier in their semester about oral cultures, right? Those cultures that passed a lot of things down, not because they wrote them down, but because they spoke them, right? One generation to the next generation to the next generation, and it was the oral communication that kept culture going. So notice what McLuhan is asserting. That in tribal villages, the senses of hearing and touch and taste and smell were developed far beyond the ability to visualize. The ear was king. Hearing was believing. The tribal life was based on acoustics. Why? Well, if you were in a typical village back in the 1800s, say, in Haiti, there is a large possibility that you might never go beyond the boundaries of your village unless you were just doing some hunting or something like that. So what would happen? You didn't see a lot of things in other tribes, but you might hear the stories. Perhaps somebody goes to visit and your tribal leader came back to your village and said, "Here's what I heard. Here's what I understand. Here's what I was told." So the ear became so essential, and they really just learned to listen, and they really gave credence to the words of those in authority. Well, then what happened? So here's our picture of some early writings, right? And McLuhan said when letters were invented, the phonetic alphabet fell into the acoustic world, installing sight into the head of the hierarchy of senses. In other words, once we started having things like Gutenberg's printing press, What happened? Well, people had the ability now to use their sight. And as they learned to read and as they were capable of getting books, remember we talked about why magazines got that big printing break, because the Senate recognized that magazines could help with literary, building literary hands of people. Okay? Okay, so what we've talked about is how the postage stamps, correct, were dropped so that we could get more people reading across America, and they used magazines in order to tell some stories. So imagine what it was like prior to the printing press, when people could never see things. And then the printing press allowed for the expediting of works for the common man. It wasn't as necessary anymore for scribes to just by hand copy everything. But now there could be a quote unquote mass production, which put the learning into the hands of the common people. The alphabet established the line as the organizing principle in life. Now think of the difference, how this would have gone from an oral society to a literary society. I don't follow you, now that we have the printing press, now means I don't think you're logical. Instead of, I will not follow in your footsteps, right? If we were in a tribe and I were to say to you, I don't follow you, you might think, well, if I turn around in the jungle, she won't be there. The alphabet fostered an emergence in math, in science, in philosophy. Life became based on seeing, not on hearing and listening. All right, so we've now moved kind of out of the oral tradition, correct? Now people say, I want to learn, and perhaps I want to learn it on my own. I want to be able to pick up that book. I want to be able to pick up that magazine. I want to do the research on my own. But what has happened? Well, McLuhan says, you know what? We've gone almost full circle now. Because because of technology, there's little reading and there's far more viewing. And we are going back to becoming an oral society. That's what Marshall McLuhan was saying. Think about that for a little bit. Do you agree? You disagree? Let me ask you this. How many books have you read in this last year? How much have you gained your information simply because a teacher told it to you, or because you heard it on the news, or because you made a very quick scan of Wikipedia? Okay? In other words, it's not bad to listen to your parents, not bad to listen to your friends. There's nothing wrong with getting news off the internet. But folks, you have to push yourself. We must be very, very careful that we are not just so bent on being entertained that we fail to just stop and force ourselves to read and to think. Oh, do you think he was right? The literary man has exchanged an eye for an ear. Full circle, he's afraid, and we're going back to an oral society. All right, moving on to another man, very fascinating, whose name was George Gerbner. He was somewhat of a contemporary. In other words, he was alive when some of you were alive. He passed away a few years ago, George Gerbner. Now, what George Gerbner was really, really understood for, we've talked about some of the studies, like the pain study that dealt with movies. George Gerbner really, really was focused on television viewing. All right? He regarded at the time television as the dominant force in shaping modern society. Now, I wrote down, remember, this is pre-internet. You say, well, Mrs. Morris, hey, he didn't die till 2005. But when he was in the midst of his key research, all right, his key research was not occurring in 2005, the year. And he believed at the time that the TV's power came from symbolic content of the real-life drama shown hour after hour, week after week. So go ahead and write these things down again if you need to. Just stop the video, copy these, and then you can come back. Again, he believed that TV's power came from the symbolic content of real life. Again, he would say, listen, television is not real. Television is somewhat real, somewhat reflects reality, but it is still symbolic. You go back, perhaps you've watched old-fashioned TV and you see like the Laura Ingalls Wilder show. Well, there is a lot of perhaps reality there, but there's an awful lot of symbolism as well, because they think that TV show did a nice job of showing somewhat, what it was like to live in the early years of the American movement out west, and then when she was living in Minnesota and over in Wisconsin and things like that. And yet there was symbolism there. But notice what Gerbner is asserting. He's saying, look, it's the day after day after day after day after week after week after week. And Scripture talks about little by little, line upon line, precept upon precept. We have to grow. But if all we're filling our minds with is symbolic reality, and sometimes nowadays it's not even real, how much are we really thinking? How much are we analyzing? How much are we pushing ourselves? He also taught that television is a story. It gives a coherent picture of what exists. Here we go again. What's important? What is related to what, and what's right? I am intrigued by his statement, a coherent picture of what exists and what is important. We've talked before about how some shows have agendas. They may choose to push their agenda. So does that situation really exist? Well, at least it does in the mind of the producer. But what's important? Remember the head of CBS saying it's our job to tell them what's important? Again, Gerbner, well ahead of his time. Then, he was really strong about saying that your beliefs can be molded, can be shaped by what television shows you are viewing, what you're viewing. He's really, really known for the cultivation theory. Now, the cultivation theory in communication deals with individuals and their perceived sense of violence as related to TV viewing. Again, their perceived sense of violence. And that was the research that Gerbner dealt with. So he would go to people, and what he did is he said, how much television do you watch? And then he did some studies. Okay, based, in the category of you watch, say, 7 to 10 hours a week, fall into a category of 11 to 20 or 24 hours per week. What did they find out? The cultivation theory dealt with individuals and their perceived sense of violence, okay, just as review. And he noted that when he was doing this research, 2/3 of all shows had violence, even back then. And I'm sure that their violence was, in many respects, limited compared to our violence. Our violence now is so graphic. But 2/3 of all shows had violence, the overt expression of physical force with or without a weapon. He taped random shows over a decade. Now, that was quite an extensive study. When you talk about doing research over the course of 10 years, that's a long time. He noted that, and what he'd do is he'd take some time slots, various hours in the day, different days of the week, but still, even when he did these random selections, 2/3 of all shows had violence. That's a lot. 2/3. And there was an average of 20 violent situations per hour. 20. That's a lot. Again, he's trying to be very random in his selection. Now, because of that, because there were, basically 20 acts of violence, here are some things then that when he went to go do his research with his people and ask questions to those who were working in his study, here's what he found. That, people, he would say to them, what do you think your chance of involvement in a violent crime is? What do you think your chance is? When they really didn't view very much television, when they were more readers than anything, 1 in 100 thought, there's a chance I'll be involved in violence. But when people watched lots and lots of television, filled their minds with this violence, notice what happened. It dropped to 1 in 10. Just a significant, significant increase. When in reality at the time, your chance of being involved in a crime was 1 in 10,000. So understand what he's stating here. His goal was to say, how does the cultivation of your mind based upon your TV viewing impact your belief that you're going to be involved in a violent crime? And he very clearly showed over the course of 10 years, people who watch a lot of television think they're going to be involved in a violent crime. What else did he find? He found that people like this had a fear of walking at night. There was a direct correlation between what people watched and whether or not they were willing to go out at night and just have a walk. You say, well, doesn't some of that depend on the neighborhood? I'm sure it does. And I'm certainly not asserting that, there's wisdom in that, in going alone at night. But these were the questions that he asked of these individuals. Next, he said, how much of this violence really involves police, police brutality? Those who viewed a lot said at least 5% of society is our police force, and oftentimes the police force being brutal. Light viewing, 1%. In other words, if you didn't view a lot, you really didn't think the police were necessarily being bad. General mistrust of people, those who had heavy viewing habits, had a far higher tendency to believe that they did not trust other people. Why? Well, probably because they were viewing a lot of crimes and a lot of dishonesty on television. So they just assumed that television was reality, right? So ultimately, what did he find? What did Gerbner find? He found that TV viewers became fertile grounds for sowing thoughts of danger, thoughts of mistrust. In other words, you are. That was really cutting edge for a couple things. Number one, he had really analyzed a lot, an entire decade. And now he's saying, you know what? If people watch a lot of violence, they're going to believe there's more violence out there. And if people watch a lot of shows in which the police are dishonest, they're going to start believing that the police are dishonest. And you say, okay, Mrs. Morris, that's great. I don't watch very much television. I don't have this fear of society. So how does this really impact me? Well, I think that in a way greater than any other generation, your generation has the ability to impact the masses through the use of media. And the question is then, if Gerbner's research is true, that people begin to believe what they see a lot of, and if McLuhan's theories, the medium is the message, is true, then I think it's really imperative to sit back and say a couple questions. Number one, then what is the wisest way we can get the message of Christ out? It is important to be doing inviting people. It's important to be, knocking on our neighbors' doors. Don't get me wrong. I think you can't, ever make exceptions for that human relationship. But how are we globally impacting through the use of media? That's just huge. That's huge. And number two, then, how can we be even more effective at it? If we've got some means of transmitting some radio, how can we do it better? How can we do it stronger? Because God has given us tools in an amazing way to be used for His glory to spread His word. That is going to be fun to watch your generation really tackle. All right, that's it for today, folks. So have a good and godly day. Of what lasting value is a good day if it's not also godly? We'll see ya.